Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of webinars in SafeArt's Belonging Project series. Today's session is Thought Leadership Strategies for Attorneys. And a special thank you to everyone joining us live here on a summer Friday afternoon, and to another welcome to those of you who are checking this out as a recording. I'm Deborah Pickett from Page 2 Communications. I'll be walking you through today's content. First off, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Belonging Project, the project that's brought us all here together, and the spirit in which it was organized. And so for those who've seen some of the Belonging Project materials, you've seen that it is organized around the principle of Ubuntu. And that's a term and an idea that became popular worldwide during the apartheid regime, as Bishop Desmond Tutu explained his philosophy, and a philosophy that carried through multiple South African ethnic groups, that our humanity derives from the humanity of the collective. So Ubuntu symbolizes the universal bond we have as a people and the focus on collective responsibility. And in this moment, just as the pandemic has illustrated how interdependent we all are, this collective, the Belonging Project, is focused on working together to move forward in our shared commitment to improving inclusion and diversity in the legal profession. We believe that we rise and fall together. So built on this concept, the Belonging Project is a collaborative network of professional and personal support for diverse legal talent across industry organizations and law firms. Through the Belonging Project, we're offering opportunities and programs to support diverse law students and lawyers during the pandemic. And this initiative will really contribute, we hope, to diversity in the legal profession and encourage others to contribute and leverage their expertise and resources. In collaboration with our industry partners, we're offering webinars focused on professional and personal development, one-on-one coaching, and a curated resource center devoted to well-being and personal growth topics. My company, Page 2 Communications, based in Chicago, is really proud to be a national partner to this project. We are a PR and communication strategy firm that exclusively serves law firms and lawyers. And so a lot of what we do is work with our client firms and the attorneys within them on communications, one piece of which is really using a thought leadership strategy to market their expertise. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're really going to try to bring that concept down to an individual level as something that you as a mid-career attorney can try to put into practice for yourself in promoting your own expertise. This webinar is eligible for CLE credit, and you'll get the forms for that in the post-webinar email that you'll receive. And towards the end of the presentation, I will give the code that you can use to access that CLE credit. I'll also mention that I'm happy to take questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to type in questions in the Q&A box that's available to you via the WebEx platform. I'll be able to see those on my screen, and we'll try to answer them either as they come up naturally in the presentation, or if I don't get to them during that time, we'll certainly have some time at the end, and I'll make sure that I cover everything then. So with all of that said, thanks so much for being here, and let's get started talking about thought leadership strategies and how to apply them. You've heard a little bit about me. I'm Deb Pickett, the founder and principal consultant at Page 2 Communications. I'm a journalist by background, so I come at my practice supporting lawyers and law firms from that perspective, but I've been working in the legal space as part of the legal industry for, well, more than a decade now. So I'm proud to be part of all of this. As we talk through this today, we're going to get kind of a crash course on what thought leadership really is as a marketing strategy, why it's particularly important for the professional services world and attorneys in particular, and how it fits in with other marketing communication, and this is, I think, particularly relevant for attorneys within firms, to think about how an individual strategy here might play into a part of a firm-wide or practice-wide communication strategy. We'll also talk very practically about how you get started on establishing some thought leadership material for yourself, and what's the process for getting published, with published material really being the key to making this strategy work for a lot of folks. And we'll talk about how you can get the most possible bang for the buck out of any thought leadership content that you produce as part of this communication strategy. So let's dive into that first question. What is thought leadership? What does it actually mean? It's a term that's very popular with marketers and legal marketers in particular, but what are they talking about when they start telling us we want to do some thought leadership? Well, the idea of being a thought leader is really just the idea of being sort of a go-to person in your field of endeavor, a trusted source who people would come to with questions or thoughts, and someone who advances the conversation in some way. So inspiring people with a new and interesting take or idea on things. And the idea of, not just the thinking piece, the great ideas and analysis piece and the expertise piece, but also the leadership piece, which is the idea that through being a thought leader, you kind of create some followership. You have a group of colleagues, peers, clients, industry contacts who come to you and look to you for advice, guidance, and perspective on your particular area of work. So thought leadership content, as we understand it from a marketing perspective, is really any content that presents your brand, to use marketing speak, as a leading voice in your practice area. So that's content that is educational, informative, offers new insights. It's really stuff that goes beyond traditional marketing, beyond a billboard ad or a web pop-up ad or even a little brochure, into really substantive content that demonstrates how well you know your stuff. And thought leadership content is necessarily targeted. It is very specific to a niche industry or clientele. There's not sort of just a general thought leader in how to live your life, or maybe there is and it's Oprah and that position is already occupied. So we're talking about very specific niche thought leadership. Some examples of thought leadership content, probably the best known are really the expert analysis or practitioner insight type articles that you see in established publications. So Law 360 actually runs theirs. They're actually called expert analysis. Bloomberg Law has practitioner insights. Lots of different publications have slightly different names for it, but it's those contributed articles that have a byline on them from an outside expert who's weighing in on their particular subject matter. Those are certainly the most high profile examples of thought leadership content, but there are plenty of other ways to get this kind of messaging out. So blog articles, whether they're on a personal blog or on a law firm website hosted blog, even social media posts, like an article on LinkedIn, for example. Certainly, sometimes in what we do as a PR firm representing law firms and lawyers, we will present material in response to inquiries that we get from reporters, and putting together that stuff as kind of dossiers on the expertise of our clients. That contains some thought leadership. Often the interviews that you might do with a reporter or journalist who's working in your area. Also webinars like this one and educational training videos, any of those things that really have that informative educational content can be considered to be thought leadership. Now, why is this important as a vehicle for marketing yourself as a lawyer? Well, there's still a cachet, even in this very digital world, attached to being the person who literally wrote the book on a topic, right? There's a reason that's an expression that we use to denote expertise. And demonstrating thought leadership, I've found, is a particularly valuable way for younger lawyers, newer lawyers in their careers, and notably women and minorities who feel like we sometimes face a credibility gap. We have a harder time sometimes being recognized as experts in our field. We don't walk into a room with the same kind of credibility that's automatically gifted to other more privileged folks sometimes. And the way we can counterbalance that is by having a resume behind us with lots of really credible expert publications that demonstrate how we have earned our position as thought leaders. I think it also really helps break through kind of traditional advertising and marketing that I think people have a certain cynicism and distrust about. So I think people kind of discount claims that they see in what they perceive as an ad, but they tend to believe in the credibility of things that they see in publications that register as credible with them, right? So if you've got an op-ed that's been published in the New York Times, and someone's a pretty dedicated New York Times reader, they're going to look at that and see that as a real endorsement of your opinion and your credibility. And the same carries over for industry publications like a Law 360 or a Bloomberg Legal Insights. I think the other piece that's really critical in our current environment, where we're in this virtual and socially distanced world, is that publishing thought leadership content, whether again it's on a blog or in an external kind of media, is very search friendly. It's very social media friendly. It's a way to make yourself visible to potential clients, to potential recruiters and colleagues who can see you via search and via topics that are relevant to them with your name attached to a topic that's important to them in a place that has credibility. So I think thought leadership has been a valuable marketing strategy in the legal space for any number of years, but never more so than right now in our COVID-19 influenced world. Now, it's important, though, to make clear that a thought leadership strategy is really only one part of an overall communication strategy. So devoting yourself, full time to publishing articles in your space, maybe a heady academic pursuit and maybe intellectually rewarding, but it's not the only component of a marketing strategy. It's one piece. And so it's important, for example, as I mentioned, the visibility, say, of thought leadership content on social media to understand that there's other work going into building that social media platform that all works together as part of a strategy to amplify thought leadership. And we try to take an integrated approach to communication strategy with the clients that we work with, largely mid-size law firms. And just to give you the 30-second digest version of communication strategy, it's pretty simple. It's really about being thoughtful around what the message is, what the best media to get that message to the right audience is. And that's strategic communication in a nutshell. It's not just one piece of that, right? So it's not just the old-fashioned idea that there's no such thing as bad press. Any media is good media. It's about the right media because it's the media that is the connector to your desired audience that best gets them your desired message. So we typically, even though that graphic shows this going from kind of left to right, message, media, audience, we actually often think about it with our clients going in the other direction. So starting with the audience piece. And being seen as a thought leader within your practice, it raises the value of your brand. It improves kind of the level of perceived expertise that you have, both internally and externally. So your audiences here are external in the sense of certainly who buys your services, who are your potential clients, and who refers business to you, if you have a network of colleagues who do that, but also very much internally, who's evaluating your work, who's making partnership decisions within your firm, if that's relevant to where you are in your career, who influences your pay. Those are all people for whom you want to be thinking about as an audience, and where it's great for them to be thinking of you as a real thought leader and expert in your area. So 3 typical groups of those audiences as they play out is clients, potential clients, leaders, so firm leadership, practice group leadership, depending on the size of the organization that you're a part of, and then also peers, those colleagues who may be referring work to you or who may be kind of interesting and important network connectors for you. Really 3 separate groups within those key audiences. So the next question then, if we're starting from that right side of that communication strategy graphic, we're starting with the audience, and then we move back to media. And most typically, we're thinking about thought leadership content as articles getting published. So where can you get published? We break media into 4 primary channels. Earned media is probably the stuff that comes most readily to mind for most of you. That's really the traditional stuff, newspapers, magazines, websites. But there's also paid media, advertising, or in the case of thought leadership content, advertorial, where you actually buy a full page space in a magazine, and your content is kind of laid out to look somewhat like the typical editorial content in that magazine, but it's a placement that's paid for. Owned media, and that in the context of law firms is a firm website or blog most typically. So obviously owned by the firm or the entity that's promoting your work. And then shared media, and what comes most readily to mind there, obviously, is social media. And in social media, LinkedIn is clearly the biggest player in terms of lawyers in the professional services market. So how law firms engage with these different media channels, they certainly look for news-making kinds of things that can get them placements in earned media. So making appearances, giving speeches, being on panels, doing traditional, what we think of as public relations and publicity, putting out press releases, but also submitting op-eds and those articles, bylined articles that we've been talking about to different publications. That's all sort of ways that law firms typically engage in the earned media space. We talked a little bit about paid media, and that's particularly sponsored content, advertising. Owned media, we see law firms doing a lot right now in the current environment on their own platforms. This pandemic has spawned thousands of blogs and webinars with folks talking about their expertise in the context of the pandemic, and then shared media. And this clearly is certainly social media stuff, but also for law firms, sometimes community partnerships and other channels that become available to them through sharing. Now, which ones can you use as an individual? And you may or may not, depending on where you are in your career, have a firm or a marketing department behind you. But most of this is available to you as an individual too. Now, obviously, the cost of paid advertising is pretty daunting as a point of entry for most of us who might be thinking about doing this individually. But that's the beauty of what we call earned media as opposed to paid media. You earn your place by submitting a piece for consideration. You don't pay to have it published. And similarly, of course, shared media, your access to social media, your own LinkedIn page, for example, completely free to you. So depending on how much support architecture you have behind you in terms of firm resources, certainly those earned and shared opportunities are available and within your control. Now, there's the question of the channels in media that you can access and also what you want to access. So in my examples of talking about thought leadership and its perceived value, the reason there is because of the credibility that people place with traditional earned media channels. Now, they've got a ton of credibility, right? For people who value what they see in the mainstream media, or even more than that, industry media and local media, it's got a ton of credibility. The other axis, though, in this particular graphic is the question of control. So from your perspective, how much control do you have over what's going out in that media channel? How much control do you have over the message component? Now, if you own the media, if this is a blog post that you're putting up on your own website or the firm is putting up on its own website, then obviously you've got tons of control, 100%. If it's something that you're putting on social media, certainly you have control over the original post, so you don't have control over everything that happens with it after you post it. And with paid advertising, obviously you have a good bit of control of the content of the ad. You can't always control the placement or the context of it. With earned media, often you have very little control over the product, right? So a reporter interviews you about some work that you're doing, a client that you're representing, a trend in your industry. And while you can be as disciplined as you can in your comments to them, you don't have the opportunity typically to review those comments and approve the quotes that they use from you. You're giving up a bit of that control. In exchange for that, you're getting the imprimatur of their credibility. Now, I think that this credibility and control question is particularly relevant for us as we talk about thought leadership and thought leadership as a strategy for diverse attorneys in particular. You know, so much of what we hear, what we see in the data, it talks about the feeling of invisibility within the profession. I think given intersectionality, this is particularly true for Black women and other women of color in the profession. But I think broadly speaking, it's true for, to varying degrees, to anyone who doesn't fit the old traditional mold of what an accomplished expert lawyer looks like a tall, gray-haired white guy of a certain age, right? So how do we overcome that and make ourselves visible and visible as credible folks within these environments? Well, we leverage the credibility that we can through showing our expertise. And if that's really your goal, what we know from our media research is that traditional print media, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, are really still very, very trusted as mainstream sources, and that the narrower the focus of the media outlet, so more and more local, hyper local is the term of art, or more and more specialized as a niche industry publication, the narrower their focus, the more trusted they're likely to be by their audience. So if you're looking to be visible and credible, then traditional media, earned media in that category is really the place you want to be. How do you start? Well, two ways. You can certainly start with an idea. This is probably the most obvious way to begin. So within the scope of your practice and the legal work that you do, what are some topics that you would like to write about? And throughout these examples, we're going to talk about this primarily as if the thought leadership content that we're doing is a written article that'll be published in a traditional publication. But most of this stuff applies just the same if this was going to be a podcast or a webinar or some other multimedia form of sharing your expertise. We're just kind of keeping the example simple here by talking about a more traditional article, but all the principles are broadly applied here. So starting with an idea, certainly something interesting or novel that you're working on. But, you know, when we keep audience in mind, we do want to think about ideas that will be most relevant and speak most directly to those target audiences. So if you've got a client or two who you have a close relationship with, and you know or have a sense for what's weighing on their mind, what's keeping them up at night, anything that you can do to address that is going to have real relevance, right? I think some other ideas or thought starters for how to come up with something to write about or do a presentation or speak or do a webinar, present about. Anything that really gets you going intellectually. So a question you studied in law school that has now popped up in your daily practice. A trend that you're seeing kind of across multiple cases and the work that you're doing, or a specific particular take that you have on a new technology or a current event in the news or a trend in the industry that you work with, anything that impacts the work that you do that you have a specific point of view on. And you want to really choose one idea at a time and narrow it down as much as possible. So starting with that big picture idea, that trend, that worry, how can you narrow that down to what will eventually become the topic for your article, your webinar, your podcast? Well, think about what's already been said about it and what's not being said. What's the insight that you haven't heard that you're still looking for? Is there some aspect of this that smart people seem to be missing? It seems to be missing from the main conversation. What are some blind spots that industry leaders in this area might have? And here's where obviously diverse perspectives are really important and valuable, right? So I think particularly for consumer-facing businesses, they have come to understand that their executives, their professional services providers need to look more like their broad global markets. And so if you, as someone with a perspective that might be different from the folks on their board and in their boardroom, can weigh in on something and show it to them in a different light, that's going to be especially useful and valued. And on that note, if you have a take on something or a perspective that runs counter to what the conventional wisdom has been on it, I think those counterpoint kind of perspectives are particularly useful and can drive conversation forward. And I think, if you can be at all forward thinking in terms of thinking about where this might be going 3 to 6 months from now, what might be next on the horizon for the particular issue that you're thinking about, that's super helpful. The other thing that we've found at Page Two in working with our law firm clients is that sometimes the very best thought leadership content comes when a firm lawyer can work together with either a colleague in another practice area at their own firm or at a different firm, or even better, a client, so an in-house lawyer or executive at a corporation, and they can work together to draft something together. Then you've doubled the audience and the value, and you've really refined the idea in a somewhat unique way. So once you've got that topic and you've narrowed it down to really be something that you can address in a single article, then you want to find a place to put it. And if you're looking for one of those traditional earned media placements, you're looking for a publication that covers the subject that you're talking about and accepts content from outside contributors on a submission basis, not a paid basis. So that's starting with an idea and then finding a publication. You can also, if you want to be really marketing strategic about this, start with the publication. So identify industry publications that your clients and your target audience really respect and trust. One recent placement that we've been really happy about with Page Two lately is with Built-in, which is an online publication that covers the tech industry. They have a great audience and readership of tech executives, while they had lots of industry-driven commentary, they had very little legal perspective on issues that are super critical to their industry, like privacy, for example, and all of the evolving, not only legislation and litigation, but just evolving regulations around digital privacy. This created an opportunity, and we were able to work with an up-and-coming lawyer who does a lot of work in the tech industry at one of our client firms, and not only pitch an article from her into Built-in, but actually help her land an ongoing monthly column in that publication. So now she's got a platform where she's positioned as the go-to legal expert in a place that tech executives are coming to look for information. There are lots and lots of niche industry publications out there for virtually any area of practice. In a recent search, we came up with 4 different magazines that specifically speak to people who own dental practices. So you need to find whatever the potential media is that really hits that narrow niche that you're looking for. And then think about who the audience is for that publication, why you've identified it, and think about what do they need to know? What are they looking for? What contribution can you make in that publication on that platform to the conversation that's already underway there, but filling in a piece or a perspective that's missing? Now, publications that take outside contributed content will typically have very specific editorial guidelines for that content as they accept it. So some of them are going to want pretty short pieces. This is increasingly true and definitely true for those that have a primarily digital platform, right? So, 500, 750 words. I mean, that's a pretty standard length for an article that you might contribute. Now, a more technical, more traditional journal type publication, they may still have room for 2,000, 3,000 word treatises that go into real specific detail. Obviously, you'd think about those two types of articles and those two types of publications very differently. Now, I've mentioned Law 360 a couple of times because they're really a common denominator across the business law space. Certainly, they have so many different verticals across industries and practices, and it's so widely read among law firm lawyers and also in-house attorneys, corporate VCs. People get the Law 360 newsletters in their inboxes every day. It really is a brand that has deep credibility and is perceived as kind of the expert resource for a lot of these things. Down in the lower right-hand corner of the homepage, you'll see the little box for expert analysis. We've seen in the last 6 months that Law 360 has radically expanded the number of contributed expert analysis articles that they are accepting and running. So people are seeing them on the homepage and then also seeing them distributed out through those newsletters. For anybody who's looking to get in front of a large audience of business lawyers, I recommend taking a look at this as a potential outlet. It's a great opportunity and kind of checks a lot of the boxes that we've been talking about in terms of visibility and credibility. So how do you write an expert analysis? Well, first, again, you want to think about those very specific content guidelines, and you can find them simply by clicking on the Contact Us icon at the bottom of a Law 360 homepage and get right into those very specific guidelines for the expert analysis pieces. It will give you very specific word counts, suggestions, parameters for formatting, all of the requirements. So it's all right there for you to look at and bear in mind as you're crafting the piece that you want to submit for their consideration. So let's say that you've accomplished both these things. You've got the idea and you've got the place where you want to publish it. What's next? How do we actually make this happen? Now, ideally, at this point in the process, you'll have some support from a marketing professional or someone who can help with the writing. The writing of these articles is a little bit different than traditional legal writing. So it's really useful to have someone who's familiar with speaking more in the kind of layperson, journalist, mainstream media voice than the more traditional and more technical legal writing that you might be doing. So hopefully you have a partner at least who you can talk through this with. And you really want to talk through what the main ideas are, kind of get an outline going so that you know what key points you want to hit, try to nail down a first draft that really brings that outline to life. Seek some feedback, make sure that your impulses about how relevant this is and how novel this is, check out with other people. And take some time, revise, edit, until you have something that really feels like a fully polished draft. You want to follow those submission guidelines very carefully in terms of word count and format, and then send your article to the editor by email. You can use very clear and concise, brief language in the email that just helps them understand why you think this article is a good fit for their publication and their audience, why it's useful. That's what they're really looking for. And once you do that, you should be able to expect to hear back within a few days certainly as folks are working remotely and schedules are changing, there's some variation in response time. But at a large publication like a Law 360, you should be able to hear back within 2 to 3 business days. And be open to what you get back. Be open to feedback that might say, we've published a couple of things on this area, but we are looking for someone who might be able to talk about this aspect of it. So you may be asked to include some new information, to remove some pieces, change some things around. Part of this process, particularly if you've not been published with this publication before, is the willingness of the writer to make whatever necessary changes the editor requests. Now, one cautionary note here is that if you are working with co-authors, if you've decided to co-author this piece with a client, for example, or you're working through your firm marketing department on this, once you start getting in there and tinkering and making changes, you do want to be really careful about version control so that everyone is quite literally on the same page with what the article is going to look like as a final product. At page 2, we have a pretty simple and straightforward quality control checklist just to go through all of the details around accuracy, around following style conventions, and just the little proofreading and copy editing things that make such a difference in how credible something is as a final product. And I have to say that one thing we are seeing in the COVID environment is that our media partners are just so overtaxed and overwhelmed with content right now that they're not able to do the level of proofreading and copy editing that we might have typically expected of them. So it's really incumbent on the writers who are submitting material to get their stuff as clean as possible when they submit it. When you've got something that's going to be published externally and something that hopefully you're going to be able to share and show off as an example of your thought leadership, you really want to make sure that it's perfect. Just procedurally, after you've submitted the article, you'll be asked to sign and return a publication agreement. You need to be really cognizant and respectful of deadlines on those, and really make a good faith effort to return a final product that matches that introductory pitch that you made. So if you said you were going to talk about this issue and why it's relevant in today's environment, make sure that you've delivered on that. Now, if the scope has changed significantly from that initial pitch, or something else has come up in your personal and professional life, and you're just not going to be able to make the deadline that you agreed to, just communicate. Reach out sooner rather than later and see how the editor would like to move ahead. Ideally, publishing a thought leadership article is not a one and done affair. I mentioned that example of the client who we were able to help land a monthly ongoing column. That's the gold standard for these things. So having a great, productive, and hopefully ongoing relationship with the editors of these kinds of valuable publications. And in service of that, make sure that the editor has everything he or she needs. Do they need a high resolution copy of your headshot? Do they need a version of your web bio of a certain length or in a certain format? And ask, when's this going to come out? When's it going to be published? And what can I do to share it? Sometimes you need specific permission to share a rewrite of something, particularly if it's in a subscription-only publication behind a paywall. So just confirm all of those details and be prepared and understand what all that's going to involve. Now, that leads us to our final piece of the puzzle here, which is really, how do you get the most value out of a published thought leadership piece? You've done all of that work of writing a great article, finding a home for it, successfully placing it there. You've seen it through to publication. How do we make sure that it gets in front of the audiences that you're trying to reach? Well, you want to maximize its impact and maximize its visibility. So again, if you've got the advantage of having the infrastructure of a firm marketing department behind you, so much the better. They can distribute the piece internally, make sure that your colleagues are aware of it, one, so that they see it and it raises your esteem in their eyes, but also so that they can share it and look smart by association. They can certainly share it on firm social media channels, their LinkedIn accounts. They can push it out to firm clients broadly via their own channels, websites, microsites, firm newsletters that you have, and add a link to the piece to your online bio. Now, a lot of this you can also do on a personal level yourself. Of course, you want to share it from your own social media accounts. But then you also want to think about what else can you do with it? Did it start out as an article, but maybe it can be made into a presentation or a webinar? Is it something that does so much to underline credibility or expertise in a particular area that it's something that should be included in marketing materials, new business pitches, proposals, RFP responses? Are there folks outside the traditional target audience, such as industry reporters or other influencers who might be interested in reading it just in service of their further work? Could you share it with them as a conversation starter? Is there something else longer term or longer form that you might be able to do with it? Is this maybe a chapter in the book that you'll eventually get around to writing? Think very much in terms of how to repurpose and recycle this content that you've created. That's what I really wanted to talk about in terms of our take on thought leadership and how it can be useful as one element of the communication strategy to help build your visibility and credibility. I am happy to take questions, comments, thoughts via all the contact information that you see on your screen. Please feel free to email me, to connect me on LinkedIn, or to check out my firm's website and send us a note there. I'm also happy to take questions and answers on the WebEx platform as we're together here, if there are any too.